watching Property TV.
Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the programme where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. Joining me today is Joanna Leggett, co-founder of Leggett Immobilier, French property experts. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you, Stephen. Nice to be back.
Hope you've had a good trip over, not too many tests. And
no, the tests are finished now, so that's good.
Jolly good. Okay, well, we hope you can get back okay too. Good. And also joining us is Byron Crellin, joining us via Zoom. Byron, CEO of Debt Squared Group. Welcome to you, Byron. Joanna, we're going to get straight on with your questioning, which is, what is the role of a notaire in France? Do they carry out the same functions as a solicitor in the UK during property purchases? In addition, how do I find a competent and reliable one that has a good command of English, as my French language is, to say the least, poor? Same here.
Okay, well, a notaire is a completely different role to a solicitor. A notaire has actually more years training than a solicitor does as well. In France, the notaire, you have to have a notaire, so you can use an English solicitor as well if you want. However, it's what the notaire says goes at the end of the day. Basically, they're government tax collectors, so 80% of the fee that the notaire takes goes back to the government. They're responsible for doing all the searches, they can make the wills, they can do the inheritance laws, etc. They can set up companies if you're wanting to buy as a company, or you want to set up an SCI, which is a group of people together. So they do all of that for you. Generally speaking, you wouldn't choose a notaire off your own back as such. You would use the notaire that deals with the property, because basically every village and every town and every city will have different notaires. When you put an offer in on a property, the notaire that dealt with the deeds of that property would be the one that we would instruct to come back in as such, because realistically they know the history of the property, they know the area, they know if any roads are going to be built through the area or if there's a flood zone, etc., etc. So generally speaking, you would use the same notaire that dealt with the property previously for many years or whatever before.
Well, just hold it there for a second. I mean, if I was in the UK buying a property, I'd be a little bit suspicious of anybody recommending to me a solicitor that was going to be impartial. How can you be sure of that?
Well, they completely are. They're completely neutral. They work for the buyer and the seller. All the contracts are done with one notaire. Sometimes, particularly with old French families, they might have a Parisian notaire that they've used for generations, and they might want to instruct that one, or they might just personally prefer to use a different one. But the fees will remain the same. It will just be split between two notaires if there is two notaires. But generally speaking, it's such a straightforward process, and the notaires are government officials as such, so they are completely neutral and they do work for the buyer and the seller. Usually the notaire's fees can range between sort of 6 and 9% for the value of the property, but 80% of that goes back to the government, so realistically their fees only 20% of that.
Okay, so effectively it's almost a VAT substitute.
Yeah, and they are brilliant. I mean, most of the notaires this generation do speak English. There are a few, that still don't speak English. If it's an English buyer and an English seller, which can happen, then although the forms will be in French, the transaction will be spoken in English. If, say, the vendor is French and a buyer is British, then we can have a translator if the notaire doesn't speak English. But in all the years I've been selling, nearly all of the notaires I've dealt with have spoken English.
Okay, just an interesting point. So you're with this notaire who is effectively acting for both sides. Mm-hmm. Does he offer any advice if he sees something that's not?
Well, generally speaking, what we would always suggest is that your notaire, the actual final act, is with both parties being there, or it can be done by proxy now as well, unless you're getting a mortgage. And in the age of pandemics, of course, quite a lot more things are being done electronically. But yes, what I always suggest, particularly if it's for inheritance, because if you're not married or you are married but you've got children from separate marriages, you need to take all of those sort of things into consideration for inheritance laws in France. So what I generally suggest is to make an appointment with the notary. It's free advice, and maybe an hour before or half an hour before the official signing, so that you can go through all of how you want your property to be left, for example, because you can't change it afterwards. You can only do it before you actually sign. And then what the notaire will do is advise you on which way is the best for your particular circumstances, and then they'll put a clause into that contract before the final act's signed.
Okay. So you really can rely on the
Totally,
service,
yeah. I mean,
yes.
obviously we've been in business for 22 years, and it is such a straightforward process. And the notary, we've never had any problems with any notaires in my knowledge.
And I suppose the plus is that it's a totally sort of regulated service, isn't it?
It's completely. I mean, gone are the days where people used to put brown envelopes under the table. The old farmers wanting a little bit of cash and things like that. Yeah, those days are long gone. Although it's quite funny, because when I first started in France, there was an old farmer that did try. I want 10,000 in cash. I was going, no, there's no cash. We can't do that. But I think in the old days they probably did. But it's completely changed now.
And just the final point on that subject. I know we've had this come up in a previous programme with you, Joanna, but I think just as a sort of matter of advice, the advice seems to be that never pay money directly to vendors under any circumstances.
No, absolutely not.
Always make sure it goes through the notary.
Always. I mean, as an estate agent, we can actually hold funds, but we don't. We always ask for the clients to transfer directly to the notaire's holding account, because as soon as you sign the compromis de vente, which is the exchange of contracts, and that can be done within a week of making the offer, you need to, after 10 days later, you need to send a 10% deposit. And that 10% deposit is held at the notaire's account, bearing in mind they're government officials, so it can't go anywhere. No. It will be held by the notaire until the time of completion. And then obviously just before completion, you need to transfer the rest of the funds into the notaire's accounts.
All right, thank you, Joanna. It sounds like great advice. And I mean, I think it's very important, as you rightly identified earlier, in these days of pandemics and being locked down, a lot of these functions are being done remotely, aren't they? So it's very, very important you feel secure.
Yes, exactly, yes.
Okay.
And the notaire is the most secure of all, so.
Great stuff.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much for that, Joanna. Byron, welcome to the show. Your question is this. I understand that the government is considering legislation with regards to collection of rent arrears accrued during the various lockdowns and closures. If this is correct, can the panel tell me if it will apply to rent and service charge, which is a further concern for many of us in business?
Well, unfortunately, there's a positive to this. Service charge insurance will be wrapped up in new legislation. So pre-COVID, before the emergency legislation came in, the commercial rent arrears recovery bill excluded service charge anyway. So nothing's really changed in the sense that you've got the ability to collect a combined debt as in rent and service charge. It's always been treated separately since the legislation changed and CRA came into effect. New legislation will be no different. So if you're a landlord or a managing agent, you've got service charge and insurance outstanding, then the protocol would be you would instruct, the likes of Debt Squared, and we would have to provide a non-enforcement service. So you can't use enforcement agents, bailiffs, for the recovery of service charge insurance, but we can act in a debt recovery capacity, or you can instruct a solicitor.
Why can't you offer a service in respect of service charge collection? What stops you doing that?
We can offer it, but we can only offer it in a pre-legal debt recovery capacity. So this is where we would pursue the recovery of the debt through the collections team. So this would be a letter cycle, telephone chasing, etc. But we would not be able to do the traditional attendance and enforcement activity. And that was legislation that came into effect when CRA was introduced It's going to be no different when new legislation is introduced in March 2022. It will still be exempt from enforcement activity.
I suppose, unfortunately, for a landlord, if he is owed service charge, then as either the head lessee or the freeholder, he's going to be obliged to make up that shortfall in the short term, isn't he, to keep the building going?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've got clients that have struggled to get service charge through the pandemic, but of course, tenants on retail parks, business parks, etc., still require gates to be secured of an evening, bins to be emptied. So it's the landlords have had to finance or fund this through war chest, I suppose, is the best expression to use. Speaking, I mean, we're long down the road now from where we were when this started, and the panic that sets in terms of what can I do, what can't I do. Landlords and tenants have got together. I think a number of our clients have said that they've had surprisingly good recoveries from tenants that have remained in occupation for both rent and service charge, but nowhere near to the levels that it should be.
Okay, Byron, thank you very much for that answer. That's very helpful. Thank you. And that brings us to the time where we take a break. So join me again after the commercial break with Joanna and Byron.
You are watching Property TV. You are watching Property TV.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Questions. I'm joined by Joanna Leggett and Byron Crellin. Joanna, your second question. I've heard that a lot of people in France are leaving the city centres and buying homes in the country. I've also been told that many vendors are putting up the price of their properties to take advantage of this situation. If my information is correct, could the panel advise me of any areas which still do offer great value for money and avoid these premiums?
Well, first of all, I'd start off with vendors putting the prices up. That isn't how it works. It's market driven. If there's lack of stock, which there is at the moment because the market's so strong, then it does push the prices up. Not the individual vendor saying, I'm going to put mine up by 10%, because realistically, you can look on the Notaries de France website and it will give you the average price for, say, a 3-bedroom home in any area. So anybody could look at that at any time and say, well, actually, he's really overpriced because X amount or whatever it should cost. However, saying that, in a lot of the provincial towns and the countryside, prices are rising. Some areas up to 8%, some areas 3%. So it really depends. It depends on what you're looking for. Yes, people are moving out of cities. The commute, to be able to commute, they want outside space since this pandemic. If it happens again, they want to have where people have had a small flat. They might sell their flat, buy a pied à terre, and then have a country house for the weekends, etc. So it has made the country properties go up in value where they've been quite stable for quite some time. It really depends on your budget to what's good value areas. I mean, if the cheapest area in France is actually the Creuse, which is in the centre of France. There you can pick up a 3-bedroom home for 63,000 euros. And that's the average house price there. Whereas if you go down to Cannes, for example, you'd be looking at 350 to 500.
But in the centre of France, so would that be a sort of rural location or a city location?
Yes, the sort of Limousin, the Creuse areas and Centre is farmland. So it's a lot of farming, a lot of farm buildings. It's great value for money because you can get a lot of land if you're looking for land for equestrian properties or things like that, or you're a farmer, of course. So you will get big farmhouses with lots and lots of land. However, saying that, areas like the Dordogne, the Charente, Brittany, Normandy, they're all much better value for money than what we would see in the UK. They're probably going to be half the price of what you would see in the UK. Right. So you will get a lot more house for your money in any of those areas. The only thing I would say is, obviously, when you're putting offers in, don't do the silly offers, because the silly offers aren't working anymore. Where we used to say, we'll put in a cheeky and, put in 25,000 under the asking price. Unfortunately, because the market is so strong, there was over 1.1 million sales in France last year. Where if you bear in mind, maybe 8 years ago, there'd be about 560,000. So it's really changed. And you might have 2 or 3 buyers for the same property, and things are selling within weeks rather than the months and the years that it might have taken in the past.
Okay. And those percentage increases you quoted, that's over the 2021 period, yeah?
In which increase?
Well, just the overall increase
Oh yes,
of
yeah,
prices.
in prices, yeah. It's actually, they've been going up since the pandemic because the countryside properties have become more desirable as such to the apartments that we might have seen in the past.
Every time you come on, I think I'm going to move to France.
Well, the other thing is the French are buying their second homes in France because of travel, because of the travel restrictions. So whereas the French would buy a lot in Portugal, Portugal used to be really popular for the French, but they're tending now to go for more coastal areas in France itself, because if you can't leave the country or borders are closed, for example, then you can go to your holiday home in your own country.
Is that increasing the number of coastal areas that are gaining popularity, or is it just expanding the ones that are there?
It's expanding the ones that are there, but the problem is the stock levels. They're very low because things are selling very quickly. So things will come onto the market and then they'll be gone. And obviously they're not building new. There is some areas where they'll build new, but most of the French sort of coastlines isn't new. And so obviously when things sell, we've got to try and replace them.
Okay. All right, Joanna, thank you for that. Byron, your second question. I'm a landlord and have agreed a payment plan with a tenant to recover rent owed to me. The tenant has now defaulted on the due instalment, and my question is, can I now instruct an enforcement agency to collect what is due, or must I commence a new legal process to obtain permission for enforcement?
Nothing's changed in the sense that when the emergency legislation came in, we had continued update in terms of rent arrears and the ability to use the enforcement tool of commercial rent arrears. Today, you've got to have 554 days worth of rent due to be able to instruct us to collect that through an enforcement agent. If you haven't got that, then unfortunately at this moment in time, legislation is protecting the tenant, and the recommendation would be you've just got to make contact with the tenant and renegotiate a payment plan or come to an arrangement to get the arrears paid. But at this moment in time, court proceedings are off the table. Enforcement, if it's below the 554 days, as I've said, is off the table. So we've got new legislation coming through March 2022 this year. My recommendation would be, if you can use CRA, use it. If you can't, then it's back around the table with your tenant. New legislation coming through March 25th of March, if not before. That will give us the clarity that we need to know in terms of pursuing arrears.
Okay, Byron, I'm just looking at your question. I think the way it's termed, it's referring to commercial property. Do any of these protection laws that are currently in place or coming into place, do they apply to residential as well, or just purely commercial?
So I've answered just purely on the basis that this will be a commercial property. Legislation in Wales is different on residential to England. To England. The Welsh government maintain protection.
They're always telling me off on this programme for being too London-centric, so I think I really am going to draw the line at going to Wales, so come on back.
Many a nice weekend in London now. But yeah, so the residential market remains, again, difficult. Tenants are protected. And again, we await legislation coming through that enables landlords and tenants to take action of enforcement, eviction services, etc., which is probably more likely on residential arrears. It's very rare that we see tenants into payment plans unless there are unique circumstances on the residential space. Mainly, if they're in arrears, 2 months in arrears, rule of thumb, the trend would be that the landlord at that point will be looking to evict the tenant from the property. As I say, at this moment in time, Wales and England, you probably need to refer back to either getting legal advice. You can go to our roadmap on our website, but you can go on the information that's available right now. As I say, we are on the verge of new legislation, change the landscape. So watch this space, I think, is the instruction.
Okay, Byron, that's very clear. Thank you very much indeed for that. And that indeed brings us to the end of the show. So a big thank you to Joanna Leggett. Thank you for coming in, Joanna.
Thanks, Stephen. And
thank you to you, Byron, for joining us via Zoom. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Property Question Time.